Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Tonight, I make an appeal to every Canadian. We are a nation on the brink. Our country has not been tested like this in generation. After 2 long years that have tested nearly every one of the societal systems that sustain our peace, health, and prosperity, we have reached a tipping point of confluent crises. Many cannot afford food, energy, and housing. Our healthcare system is broken. Many have lost jobs and are struggling with the burden of a loss of identity and meaning that comes from work. Many are struggling with children who have had more days out of school than in.
I just want to interrupt the honourable member because I'm not sure if I missed it because I was sidetracked, but I'm just wondering if the honourable member had mentioned that she was splitting her time?
Yes, with the member from Fundy Royal. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't hear it at the beginning. The honourable member.
And many are struggling with barriers magnified over the last 2 years, like racism, misogyny, bigotry, and poverty. And all of us, admit it or not, are struggling with the trauma that comes from the loss of personal control that happens when our freedoms are restricted, when trust in government institutions and democratic systems are eroded, when we are in conflict with one another, and when there's a lack of clarity on when or if life will ever return to what it once was. And most of us are guilty of finding solace in social media algorithms, politicians, and news outlets that discourage us from finding common grounds with one another while rewarding us when we calcify or radicalize our beliefs. And so to the convoy in front of Parliament Hill. Let me be clear. Protests can be peaceful, but still break the law. And the blockade occurring in downtown Ottawa is breaking the law. Trucks have never been allowed to legally be parked in the middle of a major thoroughfare or on the Ambassador Bridge or on the middle of border crossings. To those of you who are illegally blockading public infrastructure, the law must be respected. Move out. Do not afford the federal government to attempt to justify the use of the Emergencies Act with recalcitrance. To those who don't believe COVID restrictions should come to an end, let me also be clear. As one of my Liberal colleagues stated last week, not everyone can work from the comfort of home. Precious few of the class of politicians and bureaucrats who have been making the decisions to extend restrictions with no plan to do the heavy lifting of fixing the broken systems that have actually experienced the conditions of frontline workers in Canada over the last 2 years. If you cannot find empathy and common ground with the people who bear the burden of your restrictions, then you have lost the authority to be in your position. Be better and rise to the occasion. And to those who would inflame these frustrations and divisions with rhetoric, outright lies, diversions, borderline slander, conspiracy, uncompassionate behavior, and hate for your own political or personal gain as leading us through the breach, as instead of leading us through the breach, for shame. Left or right, we will resist you with critical thinking, understanding, and radical compassion. To those who would use these frustrations and division to preach violence against leaders, frontline workers, and to those who don't share your brand of rigid worldview, for shame. Left or right or left, we will resist you with the law and with courage. And to those who would use these frustrations and divisions to suggest that our democracy should be overthrown or thrown out, for shame. Left or right or left, we will resist you by fighting to protect our democratic system, strengthening it, and cherishing it. And so to the matter at hand, the historic and unprecedented decision of a Prime Minister of our nation to invoke the Emergencies Act. A representative democracy only survives when it can demonstrate to the people who put the trust of their liberties into it that their voices will be heard, due process will be given, and the independence of the judiciary will be held. Parliament will reign supreme, and that the rule of law will be maintained. Over the last several years, we have witnessed the federal government attempt to take the Speaker of the House of Commons to court, the firing of Canada's Solicitor General over refusals to interfere in the independence of the judiciary, the suspension of Parliament, massive spending with minimal scrutiny, hiding of documents, delayed freedom to information requests, underfunded auditors, and more. And we have seen federal COVID restrictions extended with no metrics or endgame. Not once has this government demonstrated that it will give back the power that it took from the people of Canada. And for that reason, the Emergency Act in the hands of this government should be opposed. The federal government has not demonstrated to Canadians that existing laws and measures, which are bound by judicial oversight, are not sufficient to end the illegal blockades. That is, there is no evidence that we cannot end illegal blockades without the use of the Emergencies Act. In Ottawa, systemic failures of local law enforcement and delayed reaction by all levels of government likely has led us to this juncture. However, the federal government has not made a compelling case that the suspending of normal democratic processes via the Emergencies Act is necessary to resolve the situation. The reality is the federal government went from doing virtually nothing about the crisis to invoking the nuclear option that is the Emergencies Act. At a time when they are asking Canadians to trust them, they are not providing briefings to parliamentarians on the situation or what action they have or haven't taken. There are many existing laws that could be used by the federal government, but they have not explained why or how they are not sufficient, which undermines the arguments of proportionality. For example, while many Liberal partisans will say we can't direct the police, the fact is that the federal government very much can offer direction to both the RCMP and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. The Section 5 of the RCMP Act states that the governor in council may appoint an officer to be known as the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to hold office during pleasure, etc. This section actually provides this type of direction. In another example, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General has the power to direct the Director of Public Prosecutions under Section 10 of the Director of Public Prosecution Act. The federal government also has the authority under Section 273.6 of the National Defence Act to issue directions authorizing the Canadian Forces to provide assistance in respect of any law enforcement matter if the Governor and Council or the Minister, as the case may be, looks at several considerations. All of this is to say that the federal government had multiple legal options when it came to showing some leadership to put an end to this crisis through law enforcement and prosecutorial means. Instead, the Liberals chose to go straight to the Emergency Act without justification to Parliament. In fact, blockades at the Ambassador Bridge and the Coots Crossing were resolved prior to its invocation. This lack of clarity is reason enough for opposition. The Liberals insist that these measures are compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as the Emergency Act itself states that any temporary measures must be compliant with the Charter and Bill of Rights. However, many civil liberties advocates and experts have already expressed concerns that the OIC, the Order in Council, has many issues with respect to the right of Canadians to peacefully assemble under Section 2, the right of all Canadians to life, liberty, and security of person under Section 7. For example, how can you conscript towing companies without violating their liberty, and protections against unreasonable search and seizure under Section 8. How can you freeze assets or report transactions without violating this section? The Liberals argue that all such violations are reasonable limits and justifiable under Section 1 as proportionate to the objective of clearing the blockades. The issue with Section 1 arguments is that these matters are for the courts to determine through well-established legal processes like the Oakes test. All of this could take much longer time than the Emergency Act could be in effect, but would have an impact on the actions taken while it was. To justify the use of the Act, the Liberals should table a charter statement to further explain their reasoning as to why and how what they're proposing is charter compliant. The fact that they have not done this is reason to oppose the Act. Further, to date, the Liberals have not engaged the Privacy Commissioner to demonstrate how Canadians' right to privacy will be maintained. Today, I wrote to the Commissioner to ask him to begin an inquiry into this matter. The illegal blockades in Ottawa must end. The escalation of rhetoric and tension in our country must end. COVID restrictions must end. And a path forward to empower and inspire Canadians coming through the brokenness of the last 2 years is what we should be focused on at this juncture, not extending government power over the people of Canada without jurisdiction or justification. Madam Speaker, this is an unprecedented use of power in Canada. We should be looking for every way possible to de-escalate the situation, as was done at the Ambassador Bridge, as was done at the Coots border crossing, using existing processes. The use of the Act should never be normalized, and in debate today, I fear it is becoming so. Our nation needs hope. We need to come together. And further extending the power of the federal government without scrutiny, without use of the oversight by the judiciary, is something that will not heal these divisions. And for that reason, Madam Speaker, I believe the Act should be opposed. I call on every Canadian watching this tonight to come together in unity unity, and move forward through the crisis of the pandemic. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to read a quote. The quote is, "What we have seen in the occupation of Ottawa and blockages at border crossings is not the right of protest enshrined in our Constitution, but illegal activity that represents a national security and economic threat to Canada." That is a quote from February 14th from Peter MacKay, previous Member of Parliament, as I'm sure this member knows very well. I'm curious if she can comment as to whether or not she agrees with Peter MacKay's assessment of what's going on.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Former Minister MacKay was faced with many national crises and many instances when he had to use his power as a minister to help de-escalate situations in the country. That is the exact opposite of what this government has done. At this juncture, instead of trying to seize power from Canadians, we should be trying to give it back to them. That doesn't mean that these blockades shouldn't end. They should. The federal government should be assisting law enforcement in doing so. But instead of it looking at ways to de-escalate the situation and give power back to Canadians, this government is doing the opposite. And for that reason, this act should be opposed.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Abitibi.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. She referred to democracy. And indeed, today, I am worried about our democracy. I'm worried about it all. I'd like to hear about her concerns, because I feel that the Emergencies Act, or the War Measures Act, are basically the nuclear options in a democracy. Earlier this week, we heard the protesters saying, "We will not back down," which is a slogan we often hear from the left. Now we're hearing it on the right, although, as she said, these labels have less and less meaning. Ultimately, we hear people saying they're just going to keep moving forward and keep pushing ahead, but at a certain point, people are going to have to talk to each other. Does my colleague also worry about our democracy?
Yes, Madam Speaker. We should be finding ways to de-escalate tension and try to find common ground instead of using division and escalation of tension for personal or political gain. This is something that has happened far too long in this country, and it needs to stop. Our country is at a breaking point right now. We need to figure out how to make people have hope, how to feed them, how to fix our broken healthcare system. That's what people are looking to us for. The use of the Emergencies Act is unprecedented and unnecessary. It does not secure our democracy. In fact, it erodes it. And for that, I will be opposing it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I'd like to thank the member from Calgary-Nose Hill for her statement. Yesterday we heard from the member opposite that the Emergencies Act was not needed to settle the rail blockades of 2020, the Oka crisis, or the crisis at Caledonia. These are not comparable to today's realities. The Emergencies Act is a drastic measure for the sole purpose of protecting our safety. For the last 3 weeks, continuing to today, our safety continues to be threatened. We have heard today from her party in a way that I interpret them as trying to minimize the dangers being posed by these extremists. Can the member explain why they chose to ignore these extremist behavior and continue to put Canadian safety at risk?
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
We need to respect the right of Indigenous and First Nations persons in Canada. At this juncture, I believe that the illegal blockades in Ottawa must end. I said that throughout my speech. I also outlined how the federal government could be using many of the tools that are at its disposal, or could have used it in the past to do so, but instead chose the nuclear option of the Emergencies Act. This benefits no one. This power grab takes away power from everyone in Canada, including First Nations and Indigenous persons. We should not be supporting it. We should be trying to find ways to come together to uphold the rule of law while resolving our differences without giving further power to the Government of Canada.
Resuming debate.